Reporters Fred Contrada and George Graham were hired in just about the same week in 1987 and first worked together writing for the Connecticut edition of what was then the Union News, now the Republican. Later, they were transferred to the Northampton Bureau and remained close friends until Contrada's death last week. Graham spoke with me in the studio about Fred's legacy.
When we first started, Fred and I and another colleague, Kathy Pappas, we worked in the Connecticut edition, which is defunct now, but Fred covered Enfield, I covered Summers, and Kathy covered Suffield. So I was a green reporter, very new to it, and Fred was more experienced. And so he gave me some guidance along the way as I got to get to know my beat and know how to cover a town. After that, it was just more Fred was a mentor to me just by example, by seeing how he reported stories, his thoroughness in stories, his craftsmanship and his love of writing and his love of people, I think, that drove it all together.
Yeah, and he had a weekly column, and he would often talk about his love of travel or various things that were going on in his life. And I know, coming from a print background too, there's sort of like two camps. There are reporters like me who want nothing to do with writing personal things, sharing in a column, and there are reporters like Mr. Contrada was, where he made it part of who he was and his identity at the paper.
Yes.
Do you know why he felt comfortable sharing that kind of information?
I don't. Well, put it this way: he had a very open heart. He loved to talk to people. He loved to share with people, and he loved to hear their stories. And he loved to tell his own stories. He was just a natural-born storyteller. He's the kind of guy you could go out for a beer with, and he would just spin stories all night long.
He also covered really difficult issues for the paper, whether he was covering the court system and murder trials, bullying would happen with Phoebe Prince. Very different side of him, right? Very
Yes.
different. What do you think? What do you think led to that range?
I think he just had this love of writing, and that was part of his range. He wrote a lot of fiction, and I think he liked to explore a lot of these different complex ideas in his fiction. But I think he just enjoyed listening to people and telling stories, whether they were easy stories or hard stories, and he certainly excelled at the hard stories. His court reporting was excellent, and he could really capture the nuances of a trial.
Did he ever talk about the side that doesn't end up in the paper, the more personal side? I know he was a family man, and covering the Phoebe Prince trial, perhaps, I imagine, was challenging for him, writing about the bullying situation of a young person. Did he ever talk about maybe the personal toll it took on him, or how he felt about covering such difficult things?
Not that I can recall, no. I'm sure it took a toll on him. Those kind of stories take a toll on any reporter, but he didn't talk about it in that way. I think it was more the importance of the story himself. He wasn't the kind of guy to complain very much about a bad assignment or something like that. He took it as part of the job.
What was it like working in a newsroom setting with him? Was it very nose to the grindstone? He came in, did his work, kept quiet, or was it a little different than that?
He would always come up to you with a smile and say hello and take time to talk about what's going on. He wasn't a nose to the grindstone guy in that regard. He would take time out from his work and joke around or tell some stories or what happened to him or his latest hike or adventure.
Yeah.
So.
To that point about the joking around aspect of his approach, I saw a video on the Republican's website of his last day of work where he sort of gave his laptop, which I understand he had a love-hate relationship with technology.
Yes.
He gave his laptop a bit of a send-off. Do you know what drove that decision?
Fred, like all of us older print dinosaur type reporters, he was somewhat reluctant to embrace technology. He totally accepted it and worked with it, but it wasn't a part of the job that he particularly liked, I don't think, but he came to understand it. In that era of the laptops, he would sometimes have technical issues with the laptop, and he'd be up in Northampton, and all our IT folks would be down here in Springfield. So that was a frustrating time for him, just trying to deal with that laptop. If he had a problem with it, he just wanted to get on the business of writing. He didn't want to get bogged down in this technical stuff that just slowed down his work.
And the IT department said, you know what, we don't need the laptop back. You can do whatever you want with it. And Mr. Contrada chose to destroy it in various manners. But I think my favorite part of the video is where he's driving his Prius over the top of this laptop. And to me, it just made me think, like, here's this seemingly very gentle soul who's driving a Prius every day to day, crushing this laptop. It was quite unique. His family gave him a send-off over the weekend in downtown Northampton. It was had a New Orleans focus. You were there. Can you tell us a bit about it?
Yes, it started at Forbes Library early afternoon, and there was a brass band there, and they played some music at the library, and then when the time was right and we had a police escort, they played When the Saints Go Marching In, and they walked down Main Street.
What was Mr. Contrada's connection to New Orleans? Why did he like it so much?
He worked there for a time, doing various jobs, and he made a lot of friendships there. And I think he went back there several times in his life after that. And I'm guessing he just loved the freewheeling aspect and spirit of that city. And so the send-off that his family gave him yesterday was beautiful and very appropriate.
And his son has created a film, right? Mr. Contrada died at the age of 66 last week of a degenerative neurological disease. What do you know about the film?
It's called Time to Go. It's a fictional treatment of Fred's illness and his family's efforts to help Fred and to try to help him ease into this transition and protect him too. Early on especially, Fred was still pretty adventurous, and his family was constantly trying to figure out ways to temper that or to keep him safe.
How do you hope that your friend is remembered by this community?
I think Fred was a true craftsman. He was an excellent writer. He was an adventurer. And he was unusual in that he covered the city of Northampton for close to 30 years. We don't see that anymore, and that really gave him insight into the nuances of city life. And but he also very deeply lived in the community as well, and I think that informed his writing.